The sun beat down mercilessly over Redstone, a dusty frontier town in Texas where cattle ranches stretched as far as the eye could see. The heat shimmered across the dirt road leading to the county fairgrounds, where a crowd had gathered for a labor auction. It wasn't unusual in those hard years. Folks had been trading strength and sweat for coins ever since the Depression tightened its grip. Hunger had a way of driving people to sell what little they had, even if it meant offering themselves up for work at the lowest possible price. The wooden stage at the center of the grounds groaned under the weight of a dozen men and women lined up for inspection. They were poor souls, faces hollow from hunger, clothes patched too many times to count, eyes scanning the crowd with a mixture of hope and dread. The auctioneer, a stout man with a red neckerchief and a booming voice, strutted across the platform like he owned the world. He carried a whip in his hand, though he never used it, relying instead on intimidation to keep his lots still and quiet. The townsfolk pressed closer, hats tilted forward to block the glare of the sun. Farmers, ranchers, and store owners alike had come looking for cheap help. Times were tight, and every man wanted more hands to mend fences, dig wells, or tend livestock without paying real wages. Some came out of curiosity, others out of habit, but all knew the unspoken truth: desperation was up for sale, and it often went cheap. Money was scarce, but labor was cheaper, and dignity was the first thing lost in the trade. Among the workers was a young woman named Clara May. She stood taller than every other soul on the platform, her shoulders broad, her frame heavy with muscle earned from years of hauling water, chopping wood, and laboring beside her father before sickness took him. The crowd noticed her immediately. She wasn't delicate or small like most of the other women. She towered over them, hands large enough to grip an axe handle in a single fist, feet planted firm as if no storm could move her. Folks whispered, calling her the giant girl. Clara's face, however, told a different story. Her eyes were soft, a shade of gray that seemed almost out of place in her hardened frame. She carried herself with quiet dignity, though she knew the stares and murmurs that followed her. From childhood, she had been treated like an oddity, too tall to be graceful, too strong to be considered feminine. Work was all she had been offered in life, and work was all she had left to sell now. Standing on that platform, she kept her chin high, though her heart beat with uncertainty. The auctioneer slapped his hand against his thigh and barked out the first bid for her. $1 for the strong girl. His voice rang out across the crowd. He expected laughter, and he got it. A ripple of chuckles spread through the men gathered below, some nudging one another, shaking their heads. $1 was almost nothing, but still, no one raised a hand. They wanted labor, but not her kind. They preferred small women who could cook and clean, not one who looked like she could outplow a mule. She'd eat more than she's worth. A man in a brown vest muttered loudly, earning a round of chuckles from his neighbors. Another called out, "Might scare the cattle away." The cruelty of their words wasn't unusual. Clara had heard worse in towns before. Still, she kept her gaze forward, refusing to let their mockery sink in. Her stomach tightened, not from shame, but from fear that no one would take her at all. If she wasn't chosen, she wouldn't eat. That was the blunt truth of her life now. The silence stretched on uncomfortably for the auctioneer. He hated when the crowd stalled. It made the business look weak, and his pride wouldn't allow that. He barked again, $1! Who'll start at $1 for a worker who can haul twice as much as a man? His whip cracked in the air, though it struck nothing, still no hands lifted. The crowd remained still, some smirking, others shaking their heads. To them, she was more a curiosity than a bargain. She was too much, and in those days, too much was more burden than blessing. At the back of the crowd, leaning against a fence post, stood John McAllister. He was a tall, lean rancher, his hair peppered with gray, though he wasn't yet 50. Life on the plains had a way of aging a man faster than the years. His clothes were plain, dusty boots, worn jeans, and a hat that had seen better days. A widower for nearly a decade, John lived alone on his sprawling ranch, hundreds of acres of wild grassland and fences in constant need of repair. Loneliness had become as familiar to him as the cattle he tended. John wasn't the sort who usually came to auctions. He hired hands occasionally when work piled up, but he preferred to keep to himself, managing the land with his own sweat. Yet that day something had pulled him into town. He watched the workers with a thoughtful gaze, not with the mockery or cruelty of his neighbors. His eyes lingered on Clara longer than the rest. He didn't see the giant they whispered about. He saw a person. He saw strength where others saw excess, resilience where others saw strangeness. The auctioneer, growing frustrated, shouted again, his voice cracking with impatience. $1! Come on, folks. She's worth 10 times that on any ranch. Who'll take her? The laughter grew weaker now, some men folding their arms, others looking away. The silence felt heavier than the heat in the air. Then, clear and steady, John's voice cut through the crowd. I'll take the giant one. The words weren't shouted, just spoken firmly enough to carry. Every head turned toward him, surprise etched on their faces. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Some chuckled in disbelief, others whispered behind their hands. A few men shook their heads like John had lost his senses. Paying for her, even $1, seemed foolish in their eyes. But John didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a silver coin, and held it high so the auctioneer could see. $1. He repeated, his tone final. The auctioneer, relieved to break the stall, clapped his hands and declared the bid closed. Sold! To the gentleman at the back! Clara's chest tightened as the words sank in. Sold. She had been chosen. Relief swept through her body, though it mingled with confusion. She had seen the laughter in the crowd, the scorn in their eyes. Yet this man, this quiet rancher, had not mocked her, had not hesitated. He had simply claimed her, as if it was the most natural decision in the world. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt the faint stirrings of something she thought she had lost. Hope. The auction moved on, other workers called, other bids placed. But Clara no longer heard the auctioneer's booming voice. Her mind was fixed on the man at the back of the crowd, the one who had spoken for her. She wondered what kind of life waited on his ranch, what kind of man he truly was. She knew only that her path had shifted in that single moment. $1 had decided her fate, and the lonely rancher who had spoken for her was now her only chance at survival. John stepped forward when the auction ended, his coin already exchanged, the paperwork signed with a few rough strokes of his pen. As he approached the platform, the crowd parted slightly, still murmuring among themselves. He ignored them all. His eyes met Clara's, steady and unflinching. She expected judgment, or perhaps pity, but instead saw something else entirely: recognition. It was as though he had been waiting for her, though neither of them could have said why. He gave a simple nod, and she stepped down from the platform to follow him. The crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads, others laughing softly as they walked away. To them, it was nothing more than a curiosity, another story to tell at the saloon that night. But for John and Clara, it was the beginning of something neither of them yet understood. She walked beside him silently, her long strides matching his as they left the fairgrounds behind. For the first time in a long while, Clara didn't feel like a spectacle. She felt chosen. And that, she realized, was worth more than any $1. The wagon wheels creaked as John McAllister guided his horse along the dirt road stretching toward his ranch. Clara sat in the back, her hands resting on her knees, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The silence between them was thick but not uncomfortable. John wasn't much of a talker, and Clara wasn't sure what to say. She had been bought before, worked before, but something about this man unsettled her in a way that wasn't unpleasant. It was as though he carried secrets, and she wondered if she would one day be counted among them. When they reached the ranch, Clara took in the sight of the land. The farmhouse stood weathered but sturdy, its white paint peeling, its roof patched with tin. Fences stretched endlessly, some broken, some leaning, all in need of care. Beyond, cattle grazed lazily under the sinking sun, their lowing voices carrying across the fields. The land was wide, almost overwhelming, but Clara's heart steadied. This wasn't just a place of survival, it was a place where her strength could mean something. For the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of purpose. John led her inside the farmhouse, the air smelling faintly of wood smoke and dust. The rooms were sparse, furnished with only what was necessary: a table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, shelves lined with jars. It was the home of a man who lived alone and had stopped caring for comfort. He showed her a small room upstairs, the bed neatly made with a quilt that had seen better days. "It's yours," he said simply. Clara nodded, unsure of how to thank him. No one had ever given her a space of her own before. The first weeks on the ranch were grueling, but Clara welcomed the work. From dawn until nightfall, she and John labored side by side, mending fences, driving cattle, repairing the barn roof that leaked whenever it rained. Her strength amazed him, though he never said it outright. She could lift fence posts he struggled with, swing an axe for hours without tiring, and haul water faster than the horse could drink it. Yet she never complained, never boasted. She simply worked, her jaw set, her eyes steady. John found himself watching her more than he cared to admit. At first, townsfolk laughed when they heard John had taken on the giant girl. Some said she'd run him out of his own ranch. Others joked that she'd eat him poor. But as weeks turned into months, word began to change. Fences went up faster on John's land than anywhere else. His cattle looked healthier, his fields better tended. Men who once laughed now muttered about wishing they'd bid on her. But Clara paid no mind to gossip. She had long since learned that people would always talk. Her world was here now, and that was enough. Despite their partnership, Clara never forgot that she had been bought. $1 had secured her place in John's home, and she carried that knowledge with a weight she could not shake. She worked tirelessly, never asking for rest, never demanding more than her keep. But John noticed the quiet heaviness in her eyes. He knew the difference between loyalty and gratitude born of fear. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he finally said, "You don't owe me more than you can give. You're not here because of a coin. You're here because I want you here." Clara's chest tightened at his words. No one had ever spoken to her that way. She searched his face, half expecting mockery, but found none. His eyes held only honesty, and it unsettled her more than cruelty ever had. That night, lying in her small room, she stared at the ceiling, wondering if a person could truly be wanted for themselves, not just for their labor or their strength. For the first time since childhood, she allowed herself to imagine a life not defined by survival but by belonging. The thought frightened her, yet it lingered. The seasons shifted, and with them, so did the bond between John and Clara. Winter came harsh and unforgiving, the plains buried under snow, the cattle restless in their pens. They endured it together, their days filled with the crack of ice, the sting of wind, the struggle of keeping livestock alive. Clara's strength became indispensable, but so did her laughter, rare though it was. One evening, as they thawed by the fire after hours spent battling a blizzard, she laughed at something John muttered about stubborn cattle. The sound surprised them both. It was rich, warm, and healing. John found himself talking more around her, sharing memories he had long buried. He told her about his late wife, Mary, who had passed 10 years earlier. He spoke of their dreams, their hardships, and the quiet loneliness that followed her death. Clara listened, never interrupting, her eyes steady on his face. She didn't offer pity, only presence, and that was more than John had expected. In turn, Clara spoke of her father, of towns where she had been treated like a freak, of nights she had gone hungry. Their stories wove together like threads in a quilt. By spring, Clara had become more than a worker on the ranch. She had become part of its heartbeat. She knew every inch of the land, every sound of the cattle, every rhythm of the work. The farmhouse no longer felt empty, and John no longer felt like a man walking through life alone. Yet neither spoke openly of what had grown between them. There were no declarations, no promises, just the quiet certainty of two lives intertwined. It was unspoken, but it was there, in the way John's eyes softened when he looked at her, in the way Clara lingered by his side. Still, the world outside their ranch did not always understand. When they came into town for supplies, whispers followed them. Some called Clara John's hired ox, others made cruder remarks. But Clara no longer bowed her head under their judgment. She walked tall, her presence commanding silence as much as it invited ridicule. John stood beside her, unbothered, his hand steady on her arm when the whispers grew sharp. Together, they were stronger than the smallness of others. What mattered was not what the town thought, but what they built together on the land they called home. As the years rolled on, the ranch flourished. Cattle multiplied, the farmhouse grew warmer, fences stood straight and strong. Yet what truly flourished was the bond between them. One evening, after a long day's work, John paused by the porch as Clara leaned against the railing, her face lit by the setting sun. He studied her quietly, then said, "Funny thing about that day at the auction. They thought I was buying strength. But what I found was someone I couldn't imagine this place without." Clara turned toward him, her eyes shimmering, and for once she didn't hide her smile. In that moment, Clara understood something she had never dared believe, that love could be quiet, built not from grand gestures but from years of shared labor, shared silence, and shared hope. She had been bought for $1, but what she had given and what she had found was beyond measure. The world might never see her as more than a curiosity, but here, on this ranch, with this man, she was seen for exactly who she was. And that, she realized, was worth more than freedom, more than pride. It was worth everything. Together, they faced storms and droughts, losses and victories, but they faced them as one. Their partnership became legend in Redstone, the story of the lonely rancher and the giant woman who built a life together. People stopped laughing, stopped mocking. Some even envied them, though they would never say it aloud. For John and Clara, the world outside mattered less and less. What mattered was the ranch, the cattle, the firelight that filled their home each night, and the bond that had grown from a single dollar into something unshakable, something eternal. Years later, when neighbors asked John why he had chosen her at the auction when no one else would, he always gave the same simple answer: "Because I saw her." And Clara, standing beside him, would feel her heart stir with the same truth. She had been seen, chosen, and loved in a way she had never thought possible. The dollar that bought her had been the smallest price ever paid for the greatest treasure either of them had known. The chance to build a life, side by side, against all odds.